Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. And this is actually more of a community announcement than some sort of pre-podcast advertising role. Earlier in the month, when the coronavirus was starting to gain attention in the media and in our broader community and by our politicians and leaders, I think I found myself, and I don't think I was alone in this, starting to drift onto social media in a relatively, I'll say, unhealthy way. I don't tend to use Twitter that much. I certainly rarely tweet unless I'm just tweeting out the podcast or something. I don't really sort of involve myself in the commentary. But, you know, Twitter is an interesting social media platform for getting up-to-date information. So I found myself going on Twitter to get up-to-date information about the coronavirus and what our leaders were doing to address this, both from a health perspective and also from an economic perspective. But having gone on Twitter and then starting to see, you know, thousands of people's opinions, which started to kind of, you know, get me a little bit irate, coupled with the earlier announcements from our Prime Minister around addressing the problems that the virus would cause our community into the future, and in some instances the slowness of how he was dealing with that started to really get me kind of frustrated. And I was getting frustrated for a number of reasons, but one in particular was that I could see what was happening. Like the rest of us, if you read any of the international media, you could see what was happening in places like China, in the United States, and in Italy, in those early days, and I was worried that that was really going to happen here. And obviously, it's very much a live risk for us all. And I was concerned that our national leaders weren't moving swiftly enough to deal with the health challenges that would befall us if we didn't move quickly enough. Which then led me to ranting and raving on Twitter, which I never do. And I had this moment, I was like, oh my God, Stephen, I've become that person. As an organizer, we always would stress to our organisers, don't go on Twitter, don't go on Facebook. Your job as a field organiser, your job is to directly communicate with people face to face and empower those people and enable leadership to bring about change. So I had to pull myself out of this black hole that was Twitter and go back to my organising roots. Which then led me to say, well, I need to challenge. Clearly, I've got a lot of pent-up energy here and frustration, and I need to channel that action into something that is motivating and it is positive. And that's when I decided to do a letter drop and reach out to all of my neighbours that live in the apartment building that I live in here in Melbourne. Which was a letter that basically was just introducing myself and my partner, saying hello. Obviously, coronavirus is a thing. We're all probably getting a little bit worried about it. I think it's a great opportunity for us to all reach out to each other and connect. And here's a platform upon which we can do it. So I set up a WhatsApp group for everyone in our building. Here was my mobile number. Please just text me if you want to get involved in this WhatsApp group. And what we can do in the future is once, in the event that we're all isolated and locked down and we can't freely move out of our homes, which is something that has befallen the good people in Italy and now in large parts of the United States and all throughout the world, that we can share our resources and help each other. With basic things like if you're not well, someone can message someone on WhatsApp and say, hey, could someone get me some medicine from the pharmacy, or I can't get down to the shops, or I'm out of toilet paper, or does anyone have any sugar, or even just talking to each other to break down that physical isolation and to look after one another and our mental health. So I did that a couple of weeks ago, and it was a great response because the majority of the people in our apartment building have signed up to our WhatsApp group, and we talk regularly now, and it's been really, really positive. And I sort of mentioned that on social media, to which then a lot of people reached out to me and said, oh, Stephen, what were the steps you went about doing that? So in the end, I created a sort of starter kit. This type of work, this type of community organising is actually called mutual aid. It's not something that I've invented. It's been around for a very, very long time, and obviously it's something that's quite useful in the scenario upon which we are all finding ourselves in now. So I just made up on the Dunn Street website a page which can step you through that. So the reason why I'm just sharing this with you now is if anyone else out there wants to know about how to go about doing that and some of the little tips and tricks that's useful to do, like don't overreach, don't try and talk to the whole bloody suburb, just actually reach out to people who are very, very near you. If you can go to dunnstreet.com.au/neighbourhood_network. Neighbourhood spelt the English Australian way, OUR. So Dunn, DUNNSTREET.com.au/neighbourhood_network. And you'll find a starter kit there with all the information you need to do to set up your own network neighbourhood and do some mutual aid and share the resources with the people in your community. And hopefully that will help you guys play a little small part in helping you guys get through what will be a reasonably long haul for us all in dealing with this health crisis that is making us all live in our own homes and not get out very regularly. And obviously follow all the World Health Organization and advice from our leaders, including our leader here in Victoria, Premier Daniel Andrews. Stay at home, wash your hands, reach out to your loved ones through online or on the phone. Go for a walk and look after your mental health. On this week's episode, we are joined by a good friend of mine, Amit Singh, who's a former economic advisor to both the Rudd and Gillard governments, and has been an advisor to the private sector in big tech and economics from a broader sort of policy perspective. He was also the Deputy Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten when he was the opposition leader, and is now a senior advisor to the economic consultancy firm Alpha Beta. And Amit is going to be on today to really drill down on the economic impact that the coronavirus is having on the Australian economy and the global economy, and what we should expect from our leaders going forward from an economic policy standpoint. Really interesting guy, and has got some really insightful thoughts on this really, really complex and concerning global pandemic. So that's Amit, who's on today's episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, please give us a rating and leave a review, which we greatly appreciate. And for all updates about the podcast, just follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Monday afternoon in downtown Melbourne, and it's great to have on the line for the first time to talk about the economic impact of this coronavirus. Amit Singh, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You and I were talking about off air before about I set up this podcast from day one to not just be a typical sort of politics centre-left podcast in the traditional sort of journalist side of things, because I'm not a journalist, and I wanted to create a podcast in which I got people on that are not necessarily household names, but are definitely people that know stuff and can create interesting conversations about things that are going on right now in our world. But one of the challenges of that is that people that do know stuff that aren't politicians tend to be political staff, and they can't go on the shows, on the podcast, because of the nature of their job. They actually work for a politician, so that they can't do that. Now, you are an ex-staffer, so you hit that sweet spot, and I've reeled you in before if you ever go back into the world of politics again as an advisor. So this is a sweet window and an opportune time because of what is happening around the globe and certainly how it's impacting economically here in Australia. So it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a really, I thought I sort of worked during the last crisis, and I thought I'd seen the crisis of my lifetime, but this one is enormous, and complex and difficult, and touches all of us in ways in which the other one didn't, and the other one was really bad.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about that in a moment. Now, I actually got a couple of questions for you on that, just to sort of give some context to the listeners about how this compares to previous economic disasters. If I can't think of it, I can't give it another name, but I can't sugarcoat it. But before we do that, I just want to sort of set the scene for yourself. When did you start to realize, what was that moment that dawned on you when you went, coronavirus is something that we probably should be a little bit worried about, not just from a health perspective, but also the impact it was going to have on the Australian economy?
So I remember working. So I worked in politics. I worked in politics around the time that you had the sort of avian bird flu, which was a much smaller but much more aggressive version of one of these kind of flus. And I remember at the time people talking about how they were worried about sort of a recurrence of SARS, because SARS was a coronavirus, or was sort of the original coronavirus. And so I sort of forgot how significant those events were. And it really didn't dawn on me, I think until really, probably now what seems like a lifetime ago, it was probably only about 6 weeks ago, probably. Where you sort of were looking around the world and you're looking at the kind of nature of the changes that were taking place in other economies. I think we all sort of thought that the Chinese economy was going to be impacted by it, but we didn't really see that, migrate to other cities in China. And so we were sort of, so from an economics point of view, I think you sort of knew that this was a problem, but then when it sort of started taking off in kind of the back end of February, then I think it was really clear that this was going to be a pretty significant event, and a pretty significant event in a way in which, economics was not catered to suit, was not catered to sort of deal with. Yeah. So there's the kind of the health side of it that seemed like it was getting more attention from the things you read, but from an economics point of view, it really became apparent probably in about mid-February, I think.
So do you think the economic impact of it dawned on you before the health impact?
So I think the problem with being a policy advisor in economics is that you very quickly stop trying to pretend to be an expert on things that you really don't know anything about. And I think on the sort of I think I was worried about the health impact first, but I think I didn't really understand the magnitude of the health impact. And I think when I really appreciated the magnitude of the economic impact, then understanding the sort of the nature of the health challenge really dawned on you. I think the problem is that the law of large numbers meant that as soon as this thing started traveling around the world, this thing was going to get really big. And I think when you then start thinking about that in the context of the uncertainty of models, so economists are very used to the uncertainty of their models, right? And let's face it, economists get stuff wrong all the time. People expect economists to get things wrong. And I think when you sort of then think about the health crisis, and I remember talking to a friend about it, and he sort of said, at the low end, we think it's about a 20% infection rate. At the high end, it's a 60% infection rate. Like anything, we're used to percentage growth of 3, 4, 5%, right? Like when you're looking at things where they're growing at that on a daily, and that's over a year, when they're growing at that on a daily basis, and probably even more, like those things can get pretty big very quickly. So yeah, I would say I was more worried about the health impact initially, but then I think the thing that's over time got me to really, really worry about a lot of things was the economic impact.
Turning your mind back to the global financial crisis in your time as an economic advisor during the Rudd government, how fundamentally is this different to the GFC? And how fundamentally different do you need as a government, whether you're Australia or overseas? How do you deal or reconcile with trying to protect or support the Australian economy?
So this is completely different. This is like someone saying that you're playing a game and you're sort of playing it's sort of saying that rugby league is the same as AFL. They're great games, but one is very one is two-dimensional and one is three-dimensional. It's a totally different concept, right? This is a much more difficult crisis. Its character is very different. The nature of the challenges that it poses on on the economy are far more significant. The the global financial crisis was, but there's also sort of like the strange part about it is it also has like kind of in a sense definitive ways in which you can solve for it, right? So what are the challenges in the global financial crisis? So I'll tell you about why this is worse in a second, but let me tell you about why I think this might be okay relative to that, right? So there's no question that the impact on the economy is going to be much more significant. But the global financial crisis had a risk of contagion that this one, where this risk of contagion is slightly different. So in a sense, the definitive day in which all of this changes is when you can have a mass-produced vaccine, right? And when you don't have to deal with the kind of concepts of like infection management that you've got at the moment. So you sort of know the kind of end point of the crisis in a sense, right? Now, there's going to be a huge amount of economic dislocation, a huge amount of impact in the meantime, but you sort of know that. In the global financial crisis, it was unknown, like when that kind of contagion would end. It was unknown how bad this debt was across the whole nature of things. So that's the sort of probably the kind of maybe silver lining. But now let me tell you about why it's all really, really bad compared to that one, right? So if you think about it, right, like in the global financial crisis, U.S. unemployment claims peaked at about 600,000. Last week, U.S. unemployment claims were 6 million. Right? Like this is like a 10 times worse kind of situation on U.S. employment. Like someone was projecting that U.S. unemployment would get close to 20%. That's depression level unemployment. A fifth of the French private sector was basically let go last week. That's about 4 million workers. You know, Spain, 800,000 people became unemployed in Spain last week. That's like 10 seasons of Collingwood members basically becoming unemployed, right? Like it's pretty intense, the kind of impact that this is having. And it's going to be intense because of the nature of where it sort of fell in the cycle, right? Like it sort of falls in many of these many of the northern hemisphere economies, which are still the kind of which are still the main drivers of growth of the global economy, falls in as part of the time of the year when they expected to have some degree of increased activity, which they won't get. So I think this crisis is significantly harder. It's also harder because it has multiple phases to it, and those phases mean that the policy responses can't rely on what we used to think about. You know, so typically the whole thing of post-war Keynesian economics is effectively that you, in a sense, use stimulus or you use investment in the economy to basically kickstart it. In fact, that can't work when the economy is actually all at home. The nature of sort of dealing with the kind of the supply side challenges are much more difficult than they had been in the past. I think there's also challenges in how you deal with it because the institutions are not, for various reasons, the institutions that we've got are wounded. They're wounded by, 20 years of polarizing kind of politics, across most of the liberal democracies. They're wounded by a public service that's been basically, attacked for various number of reasons. They've been wounded by the fact that we've lost trust in experts. So there's actually a whole bunch of different like conditions that make this a lot more difficult to think about or to get through. And it's also difficult because everybody thinks about is that we have to move away from a conventional wisdom on economic crises and to think about this as three distinct phases that are very, very different in terms of their effect. There's the first phase, which is essentially the response, which is basically why we're all at home. Then there's the kind of recovery, which is a very sort of complex kind of question. And then there's the sort of repositioning of like, what does the new economy look like, which will be very different to what it was.
The left-right political dichotomy in this country and in certain other countries globally feels somewhat discombobulated at the moment. As you said before, in the past we have been so used to traditional conservative type governments big on small governments, but very much focused on small government policy settings. And all of a sudden, we've got Scott Morrison, just dumping a whopping $196 billion to keep the Australian economy from falling into a sort of a coronavirus black hole. I'm just sort of thinking about, and maybe let's talk about it now. Like, if you're a social democratic party and you've got a conservative government starting to adopt this big spending, big government kind of setting, if you're Albo right now, what do you do?
I think I was looking the other day at basically the proportions of GDP that countries are spending, and it's not just. I think the whole like that measure is also an interesting measure, because this government has basically taken the highest possible number you could take as their public number. So the government goes around telling people that there's basically 16.4% of fiscal and monetary support in the economy, which I think is kind of extraordinary, because they basically don't need to take the monetary figure. Actually, if you just take the fiscal figure, it's about 12%. It's about 11.5%. So it's kind of interesting that the government is trying to publicly tell everyone that they are putting a lot into the economy, right? Leave aside the fact that they're actually doing it. They're even, as a positioning exercise, picking the largest possible figure that they can get, which is fine. But it's interesting looking at the levels of support that you get in other places. So like the US has got 10%. US is doing about 10%. Germany's about just over 14%. Spain's doing just over 15%. The UK is just under 15%. You've got all these places that are, that have effectively bought the kind of consensus around small government. And have got like enormous spending in the economy, enormous. I think if you're a kind of social democratic, that poses a lot of questions. If you're a social democratic party or social democratic kind of, you approach it on social democratic institute, because it really questions the kind of role of the government in the economy, right? And there's a sort of easy bias in which you can sort of fall into this trap of saying, okay, we should think about the kind of, you mentioned the 3 steps I talked about before, where you fall back into this kind of step of thinking about, okay, how do we think about, like, say, for example, we've got a wage subsidy. How do we think about that wage subsidy in the context of what it means for the larger economy? But actually, the role of government out of this crisis will be very different, right, to what it is at the moment. In phase 1, the role of the government is basically to hold it up. But in phase 2, government has to evolve and change the nature and the way in which it's actually helping to guide and shape that economy. As a policy person, I think the most depressing thing is a policy person that doesn't have a plan. And I think the thing we've got to think about is, what's our plan for the role of government in the kind of new economy? And I think that is not a reversion back to sort of old school, government as government as a lead actor. It's government as sort of fundamentally, in my view, 4 different things. It's either the funder of things in the economy, it's either an investor in the economy, where it's using basically its resources to move things. It's either an underwriter of risk, which is mainly the way in which it will play into the role or the way in which it will support individuals through this, right? Or it's either as a direct employer or producer of things, And somewhere along that line is effectively a kind of comprehensive view of what we think about the economy, what we think about the industries in the economy, how do we think about employment, how do we think about the nature of the various degrees of sort of social change that we want to achieve in that context. So honestly, I think at the moment you have to think about this phase as one distinct period, and think about the next phase and the one after that as the ones where the kind of gains for your social democratic kind of goals is going to be achieved.
How do you rate Morrison's performance throughout this crisis compared to, or think back to over the summer during the bushfire crisis? He was heavily criticised by wide sections of the media and the general public about being very wooden and stubborn and slow to move, and when he did, it didn't seem that it was enough, or that he really kind of understood the impact that it was having on communities. And I felt like at the start of this, when the coronavirus outbreak first started to really kind of take hold in the Australian mindset, that good old ScoMo Scotty from marketing was back again, and he was just going to play it out the same way. It felt like that there was a conflict or a rivalry in his mind between dealing with the health crisis and dealing with the economic crisis. And I'd said to a couple of mates of mine, Scott Morrison here has an opportunity to completely remake himself into a leader that will be perceived in the great legacy of Australian political leaders if he gets this right. But right now I feel like he's completely fucking it up. But so much has happened so quickly. Like, as you said before, like 2 weeks feels like half a year right now. And that was before that sort of that big Sunday night national cabinet meeting. And I think over the weekend, a lot of the premiers, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, starting to do a lot of media pressuring him into making a decision. How have you seen how he's played out over the course of, up until today from an economic standpoint? Has he done the right things? Has he moved quickly? If you were in government right now, if you were an economic advisor to the Prime Minister, what would you have done differently?
So I think there's a luxury in being a Monday morning kind of quarterback in all of these things, right? And I think we need to there's a sort of risk in kind of thinking to yourself, oh, we would have done these things sooner, we would have acted earlier. I think one thing that is interesting, if I sort of make an observation about the kind of the past, is I think what is interesting is there isn't really great information on trying to be able to appreciate whether like how much of a problem this is in the first place. So if you ask, go back to your original question, like when did you think this thing was really that bad and how bad was it? I think that there's probably maybe a kind of collective misapprehension about the sort of risk to our economy and a risk to the nature and way in which we did it. And I think that the way in which it's been really interesting to watch the performances of some other leaders. So if you look at the Prime Minister of Singapore, I think when it came out, because they had the experience of SARS, they were very, very clear about the set of kind of limitations that they would place on people's ability to move, the nature of what they expected in terms of sort of testing, the way in which you'd want to be excluded from work if you had any kind of illness, the nature of how their sort of medical system would revert. But his communication was very clear at the start. You look at New Zealand's reaction, I think they probably apprehended the economic challenge perhaps a bit faster than we did, and so acted almost immediately. So I think it's sort of hard to pick it, but I would say that there's kind of feels like there's sort of two distinct phases. There was the kind of phase which was we haven't really sort of appreciated the kind of the nature of the challenge. We're sort of moving in a way in which is frustrating to anybody that watches politics, but anyone that's inside the machine thinks that this is incredibly wise, which is this whole idea of like, let's incrementally move to the place that you want to go to. And actually the public, having had the experience of now sitting outside of that, the public is incredibly frustrated by incremental movements, right? Like, just tell us where you want to go. Yeah. So there was that kind of phase.
Which is funny though, don't you think, given that we are quite a conservative bunch of people, Australians, in terms of change. We kind of fear change a little bit, but it was weird, certainly getting a sense of the Australian public, like going, just get on with it. Just lock me down,
Yeah. And you got this period where you basically got to, like, what I love about one of the things I love about this period is like how there's all these old world terms that have kind of made a comeback, right? So nobody used to talk about Overton windows, right? And there was a point at which we basically hit the Overton window. And it's like all of these ideas that were basically not politically acceptable all of a sudden became back on, right? And then we got this kind of new national consensus where all of a sudden we were doing things that were like the right policy outcomes, right? Now, they may have been late, a little bit late, right? And maybe there was maybe they designed things and there's sort of ways in which you can kind of quibble on the edges about ways in which things should have worked. Like I think that there's probably ways in which you might think about sort of the wage subsidy as being really beneficial for a macroeconomic kind of signal for the financial markets to give stability in the economy. But you question whether it really has a endpoint effect on the high street, on the high street or the everyday small business or for a worker in a kind of, low paid work as opposed to sort of minimum wage work, so rather than sort of those kind of, like, if you just go to zoom out, there's a point at which we hit that where all of a sudden all these ideas became basically on, right? And so I think that there have been kind of two distinct phases. I think what's been really interesting is also seeing the kind of nature of the change of how we have approached, say, how we've approached experts, and then the way in which we've thought about some advice. I think one of the things that's been a small bugbear of mine is the way in which we've sort of tried to basically use experts in a way in which it's expedient for our purposes. And politicians of all sides have done this. But really, I think at the start of this was probably the worst example of it, which was we've got all this advice. It's like, okay, but policy decisions are not informed by just one channel of advice. They're informed by a collection of a whole bunch of different factors, and then you make a decision that's in the interests of the public, right? If you let economists decide the budget, you get the 2014 budget, yeah, right? Like that's not a you don't let one channel decide things. You have to use a range of different inputs. And I think in the early part of this, it was very much framed as, well, we've got health advice, and therefore we're just doing it. It's like, well, you take that advice, you incorporate it with your sense of all the different factors that you're supposed to think about, and then you make a decision. And some of the states have, like in the early phase, were probably doing a better job of that. So yeah, it's kind of hard to sort of pick the right. To know where the kind of challenge is. What I will say, though, is that the recovery phase, that second phase, is where policy decisions will shape a lot of outcomes, right? And in a sense, like being ready to kind of understand that challenge and to deal with it, I think will be really, really important.
Talk us through that. What does that look like?
I think so. So like there's sort of three things, right? Like one is, I was talking about old concepts that kind of make a comeback. One of the really old concepts, one of the concepts that we've not seen in this country for like 30 years is the kind of notion of hysteresis, right? Like this, which we're going to hear a lot about hysteresis, which, we didn't get in the Fairfax broadsheets, but we're going to see a lot of it now, right? Which is essentially this idea that once you leave the labor market, it's really hard for you to come back to it. And it's really hard for you to come back to it the same position that you did. And even when we got to even in the late 2000s, there was a piece of Treasury research that effectively showed that if you lost your job in the 90s recession, you basically never got back into the labor market. Even as late as the mid 2000s, when the country was booming and everybody was relaxed and comfortable and whatever Howard was saying. I mean, like even in that point, there was no. Those people had basically been left behind. And the way it works is to think about it as like there's always something coming into an economy and there's always something coming out. And if you fall off that, you can't go back to the start of that queue to come back in, because that queue of people coming in, right, is long, right? Like, and it's like long by a long shot. And so like thinking about the people that have basically been dislocated from that economy and how they come in, not just as individuals, as employees, but as small business owners, as people that basically have, even medium business owners, right? Like, and what do you do about that spare capacity in the economy? I think that's going to be like an incredibly difficult thing to sort of deal with. The other thing is also that the pace of change that we're talking about. So I talked about how you had this sort of 6 million people in the kind of dole queue, in the unemployment queue in the US over, right? Like no institution that we have is ready for that, like no existing institution, which is why we've had this kind of period where a whole bunch of things that we would have previously never thought possible are now eminently possible, is because we need to think about like whole ways in which we change the nature of social, of the social safety net. Like we need to move past the binary where the way in which you're classified matters to the way in which you're protected. Like everybody should be protected equally. There should be some level of support regardless of how you do it. You need to move past the kind of three payers sort of system, which we thankfully don't have too much of a problem with versus the Americans. But the Americans or other systems, and I think we need to start having a serious conversation about how we might evolve like the new safety net that is actually reflective of the way in which we work. So one thing we don't talk about at all is we're learning very, very clearly here about the importance of sick leave, right? But like, what about concepts like universal family leave? I'm not talking about the income because I'll have some views on that, but like, things like, so sick leave is important, but what about caring for like older people? What about caring for, kids? Like we've had this whole new change of the way in which we think about childcare. We'll have to rethink the way in which the sort of the care sector works and what that looks like. So there's a whole bunch of different things that will have to change. Yeah, a whole bunch of different things that will have to change.
It's an interesting point you make, and I was just thinking about that when I was sort of trying to pull together some questions for this, and I jokingly had a question in there about the impact of COVID-19 will change the way in which our society works. You know, you can't unscramble an egg in the way that what's happened so far. You know, people working from home. Will our attitudes towards that be a lot better? You know, all of a sudden homeschooling is now the cool thing, whereas years ago we always thought those kids were freaks. You know, retail therapy on the high street are those days over because we're all just now shopping online. You know, the way that we live our lives is going to be fundamentally changed, but the marketplace, in terms of the job marketplace, I just find that interesting to see how that reshapes. And the point you just made before, I hadn't even considered that those who do drop off find it hard to get back in again. And I remember the recession during the tail end of the Hawke Keating years, and we hit that figure of 10% unemployed, which was over 1 million people were without a job in Australia. I don't know if our latest unemployment figures have come out yet.
They haven't. That's one of the challenges that we've got here, is that we don't have, like, we'll get data over the next few weeks and we'll get a better sense of it. But one of the challenges that we've got is that a friend of mine tells this funny story about how during the financial crisis, you know, we'd sort of sit down, like during the financial, or various times if you've worked as an economic advisor to a senior politician, you'd sit down and you'd sort of say, oh, you know, like we really are concerned about this sort of this escalating kind of crisis in the US, or we're worried about this, or, you know, a friend recalls about how they sat down with the Prime Minister on the day after Lehman Brothers basically collapsed, and they said we should probably get in some Treasury officials and talk about like how the economy's tracking. And they walked in, they had all these sort of, you know, these economists, and they said, oh, okay. They asked someone from the ABS, and they said, so how's the economy tracking? They said, well, in the June quarter, the economy grew by 0.3%. And it was like, that's great, but like 3 months ago was an eternity. And in this crisis, like last week was an eternity, right? So the kind of quality of data is going to be a problem. But yeah, I think you're going to get situations where of those numbers of people that were unemployed in that crisis, many moved into the long-term unemployed, and many fell out of the labor market altogether. And that's not a great outcome if you were talking about sort of social democrats and what social democrats need to think about. I think that is not a great outcome for us. It's not a great outcome for social mobility, which should be the kind of governing kind of, you know, optimization function of social democracy. You know, everyone will have a different view, but you know, and so I think that's a kind of pretty significant challenge. One of the things that's interesting is I think it actually does. There will be a lot of focus on the nature of the recovery. You know, is it a V or a U or an L? You know, all of those things kind of matter. But I think the one truth in all of them is that we don't unscramble the egg, right? Which was kind of your point. And I think that matters. That matters for all of the kind of real world. There's an amazing Politico piece that, you know, people can kind of Google, where they ask a bunch of people what they think is going to change, and it's sort of really interesting what some of the things that people kind of point out. But one thing that I kind of think a lot about is it actually changes the relationship that the big institutions in the economy have to all of us and to each other. You know, so government is all of a sudden a bigger part of the economy, and we talked about that before. But companies are also a different player in this type of economy, right? So companies are no longer companies in service to their shareholders and their bondholders, and that's pretty important. But they're also in service to the public and the government, you know, in essence, as representative of the public, right? Like a lot of companies have been able to continue to operate in this, you know, during this period because they're nationally significant. Some companies have required the support of government to and continue to exist. Some companies have required the support of government to be able to effectively go into hibernation mode. Yeah. The nature of our kind of call on big utilities and big providers of different services will change on the other side of this crisis. You know? And so So those things, like the kind of way in which companies think about their supply chains and their sort of labor practices, will change a lot. So so the relationship of companies will change. The relationship of the third sector will change. The relationship of how we think about, care work, which has always been the largest part of the economy by far, or has been, at least for our lifetimes, your and my lifetimes, right? But has not got the kind of attention that it wants. I sort of have this kind of view that, if this is what, some people have used the kind of characterization that this is war, right? I wonder whether on the day in which the vaccine comes, are we going to have a parade in the streets where like every, doctor, nurse, and like care workers basically walking through the streets? This completely changed the game on the fact that care work has always been undervalued, that we've never really understood what its purpose was. And maybe what we're now talking about is, in the way in which people wrote, in the way in which people talked with fascination about the Greatest Generation, and they talked about the sort of the world wars, and they eventually wrote it into like comics, and we had an entire Avengers, world about it, right? Like then maybe that kind of thing becomes about how people do care work, right? So I just think it kind of doesn't change. You talked about sort of the Prime Minister before, right? Like we're all Keynesian now, but what does that actually mean? What does that actually mean into the future? And it's a fascinating question to think about, as much as it's sometimes a bit scary.
With all of this money that the government's borrowing to pay for things like the wage subsidy and everything else to go along with it, and I'm sure there'll probably be more announcements going forward. I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I know that when I borrow money off of people, and I know that money is quite cheap to borrow at the moment, but is there, what's going to be the long-term impact of that? Because I think that a lot of people out there just sort of think, oh, well, the government can just keep on borrowing money and, can maintain this hibernation that we're in right now. But that can't go on forever, surely. What should we be concerned about in terms of the amount of borrowings that the government's... When does this stop? Like, when do we have to draw a line in this? Or can we just keep doing this? And if we do, that just really does fundamentally change the way that we operate.
I think the one thing that is complex about this time is that everybody is doing it, right? Like it's not a question of, I think normally you sort of worry about this because your relative position is not great. Your relative position versus like others that are borrowing is not, so you don't want to end up in a situation where you are basically have a huge amount of debt versus like, your other middle developed economies not having that, or like advanced economies basically being where the economic cycle is on an upshot. Right? This is going to be strange because everybody's going to be quite heavily indebted, right? And there will be indebted because the money exists, right? But I think there's going to be this is going to be a fundamental question about how we think about economics, how we think about sort of how we think about like fiscal and monetary economics, how we think about what that means for the nature of how we think about sort of borrowings and the nature of government. I don't think this is at an end, by the way. I think that there's probably another stimulus. They probably need to do another stimulus before, like in the kind of response phase, even before we get to recovery, because I think that there's probably some degree of pressure on for businesses on fixed costs. And I think that there's some degree of pressure for businesses on, and so what I mean by that is like, if you're a business, like you've kind of got the employment part of it, which is your biggest cost, you've sort of got that handled by the kind of the wage subsidy. Mm-hmm. If you're, you've kind of got a little bit of sort of protection for some of the other expenses through some of the earlier stimuluses. You kind of like, if you wanted to spend money, you could, but not like that's sort of neither here nor there. But the things you don't have really protection for is some of the big fixed costs, right? So and things like commercial tenancies, things like that. So you are going to need to have new. I think they'll have to have some version of a new stimulus, but they're probably not in the kind of eye-watering kind of magnitude that we've seen. And I think you'll need to have stimulus in the kind of recovery phase, and you'll need to have stimulus in the recovery phase, and maybe you can do that through being a bit more creative, and maybe you can do that by curtailing the length or at least managing the length of the crisis. So maybe you don't need to spend 130 billion in the end. Maybe it actually ends up coming in at a bit less than that, or quite a bit less than that. I don't know on the wage subsidy, but I do think you need another stimulus. I do think you'll need to spend more. I think that where does this end? Nobody really knows. What happens with all of this debt? I think the kind of conventional wisdom is if you get the kind of global economy back on the right footing, then the kind of recovery can happen reasonably quickly, at least at the kind of at the sort of top end of the like at least at the headline level of the economy. Even though there'll be some pressures underneath. But yeah, we started this conversation by saying it's unlike any other crisis. It's because actually some of the fundamental rules of how we think about economics have sort of changed. One other thing that's sort of interesting is that Keynes himself didn't really think that Keynesian economics would last until this long, right? Like he used to talk about how everybody was like a wise man held hostage by a defunct economist. I think you kind of like it's almost in a sense we probably should have changed this. We probably should have started doing that. And like Jim Chalmers was probably way ahead of his time when he was talking about sort of well-being budgets and things. In fact, actually, he was probably at the right point of that kind of cycle to think about it. But maybe we do need to have that type of conversation, and that the debt that we will have from this is an issue, but it's an issue in the midst of a series of different kind of factors.
It's been interesting to watch how, since the creation of the National Cabinet, which consists of the Prime Minister and all of the state premiers and the two chief ministers from the two territories, work together. Reading a piece in The Guardian on the weekend by Catherine Murphy. I don't know if you got a chance to read that.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, interesting kind of insight where obviously, I guess a number of those different offices have fed her some decent storylines. Even talking about a level of some degree of dialogue and conversation between a conservative federal government and the head of the trade union movement, something that we've not seen since the days of the Accord. Are we moving into a new world in which we have returning to sort of Hawke-Keating politics of consensus again? Like, is this something that is going to happen to us as well, that's going to come out of this crisis? Or is this just kind of that moment in the First World War at Christmas time when the troops all declared a ceasefire and got out and had Christmas dinner and kicked the football around and then go back to beating the shit out of each other when it's all done? I mean, what do we expect from this?
I don't know. I would say, I do think that there's probably, and this is what I said, like it felt like at some point something flicked the switch, and I don't know, I'd kind of like to work out what that was, where there was early in the crisis, it still felt like it was a bit of a contest, there was this kind of, you believe in this, like there's a trade-off between health and the, and the economy, and now we're in the, actually the health and the economy are one factor, like we need to worry about both things at the same time. The way in which the states and the federal government worked on like moving to stage 3 and the wage subsidy was sort of, like showed this thing can kind of work in practice. I think that there's probably some pressures, like actually we should be thankful for a federated system. Because a federated system allowed that contest to take place at the start. That meant that we were making certain actions to actually deliver what we needed. And if we didn't have that, maybe we would have lingered in that sort of denial phase for too long at the beginning.
And which is interesting as well, because given that in that room there are powerful states and there are less powerful states, but the federation is supposed to be about creating that equality amongst the different populated states. And I feel like it's gone through a good stress test. And sure, there's been challenges and sort of fuck ups along the way, but by and large, I think it's actually worked quite well if compared to the United States right now, which I could do a whole another podcast on, because their federated structure is causing half the problems that they're having right now.
I saw something yesterday where, Trump was praising, where the president was praising Governor Cuomo's proposal to allow doctors that had been registered in different counties to work in other counties, which seemed to me like the most ridiculous thing I've heard about interstate boundaries since hearing about the fact that a fridge plumber in Albury can't fix someone's fridge in Wodonga. Like this was sort of like next level kind of craziness. Like in the middle of this, they were worried about that type of cross registration. There's a kind of hilarious Thomas Pynchon book which I think is kind of funny in this, right? Where he sort of says that you've got the kind of like this period that we've been in, this contest in politics. It's a period in which we've been. There's been like the chaos of the peeves, the whims, the hallucinators, the all, right? And like we've kind of moved past that. Like there's this kind of new civic consciousness that actually we need to like work to solve this. Like actually this is an actual problem, right? Like, oh no, we've actually come across an actual problem. Yeah. So I don't know. Look, honestly, long may it last, but I think we'll get. I think if anything should give people pause as to the magnitude of this problem, it's the fact that it was this big that everybody had to put aside their stuff, put aside their kind of their silliness and actually get on with trying to sort of work together to solve some of these kind of challenges. I think the hard part is going to come. I think that. But I think the way in which that hard part works well is if, in particular, the bigger states and the Commonwealth can work to get the kind of I think that we talked a lot about the things that will change. It's kind of like it'd be interesting to sort of talk about the things that were probably trends that were happening anyway, but are now going to become more important and more significant trends, right? Like so. Yeah, like a really big thing was the fact that like basically all of Australia's economic growth was very fast, with the exception of what we dug out of the earth and shipped overseas, or what we dug out of the what gas we basically put on boats and sent off. With the exception of those things, like all of the economic growth was really now starting to basically be Sydney and Melbourne. It wasn't really even Victoria and New South Wales, And I think this kind of like mega metropolis kind of question is going to become a much more important one when we come out of this crisis, and what does that sort of mean and look like? And we're already on the sort of trend towards thinking about ways in which we decarbonize the economy. That's going to be in a much more aggressive phase. Digitization, like we're talking over video conferencing, right? Like which this would have been exciting. This would have been exciting to do when we lived far apart, but we're literally 4 blocks from each other. So those types of things I think are going to be interesting.
Martin Luther King one of his most famous speeches, actually, the I Have a Dream speech, we call it the I Have a Dream speech, but it's the thematic of that speech was the urgency of now.
That's right. Yeah.
And I can't help but keep on thinking about that every day that I get up and go to work, and consider the urgency of now and the way that we all around the world have reacted and responded so quickly to this. It's been remarkable. Interestingly enough, last thought before we wrap up, Earth Hour happened. You may or may not have known that last week. But do you remember that was a big thing, and the effort that went into like a public awareness campaign to try and encourage global citizens to just turn off their lights for an hour once a year to do something in helping our Earth, and yet a global pandemic can literally shut down an entire economy and force us all to be working from home and make drastic decisions about how we and adjustments to how we live our lives. I think there's a lesson in there somehow, and I think it'll take us a while to extrapolate the learnings from that and fundamentally change the way that we live our lives, and hopefully improve the way we live our lives going forward.
There's just one thought I think about that change stuff is like is also the way in which it's sort of reframing how we think about change. And I think what's good about it is that it means that it just means that we're now willing to sort of accept things that or test things if we're uncomfortable with certain things, right? Like I was reading the other day, this is the sort of I wanted to kind of leave on this part, and so I was reading the other day about how China's closed its last coronavirus specific hospital. Indian doctors are basically treating coronavirus by basically hacking together a set of different kind of arrangements, like basically based on like ways of treating symptoms, and it sort of seems to have worked in a place that doesn't have a super sophisticated health system. But also, the one thing that I read the other day that gave me this kind of sense of hope, but also this kind of sense of how, like as you said, the urgency of now, is how Bill Gates is funding 7 factories to build the vaccine, right? And they know that 7 is not useful, right? They think that at some point they'll reduce it down to, they'll pick 2, but they don't want to wait for when they've picked the right one to then start building the factory. So they basically said to the 7 guys that are closest to it, we'll fund you to build your factories, and then effectively, once we get to the point where it's 1, we'll then re-engineer the other 6 to make that work. And I think that's kind of that's like the weird urgency of the time that we're in.
It's remarkable. Amit, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the show today. We could go on and talk about this for a while, but the good thing about coronavirus is that we're going to be stuck here for a while, so maybe we can come back and catch up again and see what's happened in the next, if we leave it like 3 weeks, it'll feel like 7 years, so, we could, so much will move in that time.
That's right. Can you imagine how dogs feel?
Anyway. I read today that I don't know if it's true or not. A tiger has been
at the Bronx Zoo. At the Bronx Zoo in New York, a tiger has caught coronavirus from an asymptomatic zoo worker.
Yeah. So, cat lovers, beware. All right, let's leave it on that note.
Thank you.
Be well. Thanks for coming on the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks heaps.